Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, perhaps even, depending on where you are. Welcome to today's Stay Ahead series, Global E-Invoice Compliance for the third quarter of 2026. Time's flying. As you probably all are deeply aware that things are moving extremely rapidly in the e-invoicing compliance space, and we have quite a bit to cover today. Before we go into the details, if you have any questions today, please feel free to use the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will try to answer these as we go. Type them there so our backstage team can look after your questions and answer those. Also, in the resources section, you can find further documentation, blogs, and other interesting elements and content that you might want to use in your daily work. Also, look out for some poll questions. We have a few questions for you along the way. It's always really good to answer these because it gives us an idea of what we should be preparing for you each time we do these sessions about global compliance. So let me jump in. I'm Ruth Van Hilt and I run the Invoicing Compliance in Tungsten Automation. Been in the market for quite a while, quite possible that many of you already know me. And it's basically my job and my team's job to ensure that we stay abreast of the developments in the e-invoicing compliance market, that we understand how mandates work, which countries are going to come next, but also that we ensure that the Tungsten Automation products, specifically Invoice Agility Plus, behaves the way it should behave and supports our customers with, on the one hand, compliant electronic invoicing, both inbound and outbound, but then also making sure that our customers have the opportunity, the potential to automate further. I'll speak a little bit about that at the end of this particular session today. So what are we covering? As always, we start with some country announcements. We'll speak a bit more deeply, in a bit more detail about Slovakia, the United Arab Emirates, and also New Zealand. An interesting situation there, I would say, with regards to where they are moving. And of course, we always hear about Europe. We always hear about US and to an extent Latin America. But let's not ignore what's going on in Asia Pacific. So that's why we have some information about New Zealand's changes. And of course, as always, this is by no means completely exhaustive. Many countries are going for e-invoicing mandates at this point in time, or are announcing or are planning to go live. And in that sense, it is a snapshot. But if you require more information about specific countries, please do not be shy and reach out to us. We'll be happy to help. Also, very recently in July, France announced some changes or maybe further clarifications on what will happen in the first phase of the French mandate, and they call that the startup phase. We thought it was important enough to spend a bit of time on today, even though we didn't necessarily advertise this session today to be about France, but we think it's an important update, and therefore we will spend a bit of time on that. And then going back to my normal mantra, compliance doesn't exist in isolation. It's really about automation. If you have time left, we'll be very happy to answer your questions live, or else if we can't do that straight away, we'll take these away and come back to you separately. So since our last time in the webinar, so to the Q2, and if you don't have access to that, you can have that on demand. Again, go to the resources section, and you will see the Q2 on demand version of that webinar. We spoke last time about the expected changes until 2030. We featured a number of countries that have announced mandates and will go live in the next, let's say, 18 months, including Spain, Slovakia, and we spoke about the VAT changes in China, and also made a comment that aware is not the same as prepared, basically saying that, you may know about these mandates, but you have to be ready. At some point, you need to transact under that mandate. You need to be able to exchange invoices between suppliers and buyers. You need to maybe have assigned a partner or a platform or an ASP. And in many cases, you also need to report information to the government. So the point is that, you may be aware of it, but you need to be prepared. And that's actually really, really important. So then also in the last webinar, we mentioned a number of mandates that have gone live: Croatia, Greece, Brazil. We featured them last time. But now also Oman, that on the 1st of August went live with a large taxpayer pilot. And of course, it's interesting to see where Oman is going to move in the next few months while they roll out their phased approach of their e-invoicing mandate. And it goes to show that even relatively young VAT regimes like the GCC states or like the Middle East, if you wish, even they embrace mandates very rapidly. In a sense, they are leapfrogging some of the countries that have had VAT or GST or SST for much, much longer. It's an interesting development, and it shows that basically the entire development with regards to countries, governments, tax offices embracing a new structure, VAT reform, and also using technology to get much earlier sight of VAT income is unstoppable. And to that effect, let's go to the next slide, which actually shows that this picture, we show that every time. And we show it every time because we can't stress enough that, as I just said, tax offices are genuinely embracing CTC, are genuinely embracing mandatory electronic invoicing, simply because it works better, but also it gives them the ability to use technology to understand VAT income or indirect tax income much earlier and are much less dependent on company self-assessment as you wouldn't be in a post-audit environment. These are very strong, undeniable drivers. It gives tax offices the insight I was just speaking about. How much VAT money are we expecting to capture and collect this year? But also it provides them with data of economic activity, which can be used to target economic policy much, much better, or tax policy much, much better. So as I said, it's an undeniable driver, and it will continue. And we still believe that round about 2030, the world may look more or less like this, where a majority of countries have embraced a version of CTC, mandatory electronic invoicing, or e-reporting, or a combination thereof. And if you look at the number of countries that is currently announcing to go for an e-invoicing mandate, and of course, the first thing that strikes you is that pretty much every European member state is now looking into a domestic mandate. That is clearly driven by VIDA. We said this before. VIDA goes live in July 2030 with the digital reporting requirements for cross-border invoices within Europe. So one member state sending an invoice to another member state, where both the supplier and the buyer must report that invoice to the tax authorities, and then in turn, the tax authorities need to report those transactions to a central database. It is important for countries to be aligned with that, and you see a lot of pre-alignment with VIDA happening at this moment in time. You see it in Germany, you see it in Slovakia, you see it we have seen it in France, in Belgium, and I would say the snowball is rolling, and in that sense is unstoppable. You can see here by the sheer number of countries that are going live in Europe alone. It's going to be incredibly busy over the next, call it 24 months or so, where the majority of European countries will be under some sort of a domestic DRR mandate. But it's not just Europe, as you can see here. There's other countries outside Europe too, which are moving, and they are moving also very, very rapidly. I don't have enough time today to go through each country separately. You see a large number of countries. Some countries you see twice, and that's because they're phased approaches. So Germany, for instance, goes live with their issuance mandate, so the obligation to issue electronic invoices from the 1st of January 2027, but it doesn't roll up the entire market. It only applies to companies with revenues in excess of 800,000 euros. But then in 2028, it rolls up the entire market. And we see other examples of that, of phased approaches. And unfortunately, it's not the only slide we need to show you for upcoming countries. There's quite a number. Again, some of them are in very early days in public consultations, like Hungary, or further advanced with draft legislation in place that only needs to be agreed by the government, or planning draft legislation and detailed requirements, for instance, like Ireland. So at the end of the day, what we are looking at is a very fast-moving landscape. And unfortunately, even within Europe, still today, every e-invoice mandate is different. None of these you've just seen here are the same, or even sometimes even remotely similar. They may be wildly different. And that puts a big burden on companies, on businesses that trade in multiple of these countries. And I guess many of you do. And that basically means you need to be ready for variable mandates with different requirements in different countries, different scope. And that simply makes this, in a sense, extremely intrusive and also extremely distracting. But the good news is we're here to help, and we can remove a lot of that variability for you. So let's go into a bit of detail, as I said earlier. Let's start with a number of countries that all talk Peppol. That's an interesting situation. So everybody says, we're going down the path of a Peppol mandate, or a Peppol-inspired mandate, if for lack of a better description. But they all talk Peppol, and still, even if they all talk Peppol, and even if their models are very similar, for instance, between Slovakia and UAE, the models are very similar. It's both a five-corner model. If you go under the hood, and if you look at the detail, they're actually quite different, and some really different principles apply. So if you look at Slovakia, Slovakia goes live on January 1st, 2027, not too far away. It's a Peppol five-corner model. The tax authority is the fifth corner. A model that we understand, a model we've seen before, not dissimilar to France, actually, if you look at it in more detail, even though there is no e-reporting of international transactions or B2C transactions, the whole principle of having five corners in a model where the supplier is corner one, their provider is corner two, the provider to the buyer is corner three, and the buyer themselves are corner four, tax authority are corner five. That's very standard for five-corner models. The invoice format is Peppol BIS, something that is well understood, standardized in most of the European countries that use Peppol. And invoice data needs to be reported to the tax authority in a tax data document in a timely manner. That needs to be done by the access points to both the buyer and the supplier. Well, that was the plan. But from January 1st, 2027, the supplier access point must indeed report the tax data documents to the tax authority, but the buyer access point doesn't have to do that yet until 2030. And that's when the alignment comes in place with VIDA, because reporting of transactions to the tax authorities from the buyer side is actually also a VIDA requirement, and that's why they start aligning with VIDA. It's a typical business scope that you see in Europe, established VAT-registered entities in the country. So that means that if you're not established in the country, you're not necessarily in scope. The interesting thing about Slovakia is that it applies in one go to everybody in the country. So if you are a Slovak company with an establishment in the country, it will apply to you regardless of the size of your business, and that is actually different in some other countries. The other thing is that the service providers needs to be accredited. So whoever is your Peppol access point, it is not sufficient that they are registered as an access point with Open Peppol. They also need to be accredited according to the Slovak legislation. And it basically means that they need to go through a series of tests. They need to prove that they can transact all the different kinds of document types that may exist in the country, self-billing, standard tax invoices, things like that. But also that they are a legitimate and genuine company. You do not need to be established or or registered in Slovakia. However, the service provider must have, and that's simply a requirement, you must have an electronic mailbox in the country. And frankly, you can only really get that if you are a Slovak company or if you have a power of attorney locally. So it is a fairly complex accreditation process. We're right in the middle of it. So Tungsten Automation will be an accredited service provider in Slovakia, and we're right in the middle of that accreditation process. As the deadline is really, really short, and the Slovak government realizes that not everybody is aware of this, that as always, they are currently running a series of public webinars, conferences to enable and make their taxpayers aware of the upcoming legislation. And that probably is indicative of the fact that they are not planning to delay. So far, they've been very, very consistent with their deadlines. And I think if anybody on the call is hoping for a delay or a grace period, it probably won't happen. So if you're not ready yet, and if you haven't started planning, please do so. ASAP is really important that you get going. It is Peppol. There is some complexity, but the complexity is mostly about getting your systems ready to receive and send electronic invoices and to be registered in the Slovak S&P, the local phone book that you need to be registered in. PDF paper invoices are no longer allowed from the 1st of January 2027, and the same goes for EDI transactions. They are not allowed from January 1st, 2027. So a draconic change, single implementation for all taxpayers in the country in one go, and an immediate implementation of a 5-corner model. Compare it to Belgium, did the same, went live with the entire country in one go, but there was no 5th corner until 2028. So in that sense, again, the entire mandate speaks Peppol, but it's different again when you start looking into the finer details. And in a sense, the same goes for the UAE. Goes live on the same date, January 1st, 2027, but here the approach is phased. Phased as in, from January 1st, 2027, larger companies in the country, those companies with revenues in excess of 50 million AED, they need to go live on that date. Everybody that has revenues below that threshold can wait until July 2027. There's another milestone. Larger companies in scope for the January 1st release 27, they need to appoint their service provider, so the accredited service provider, ASP, by October 2027. That was delayed earlier. The original date was July 2026. The smaller companies in scope for July next year, they need to appoint their ASP by March. So there are 2 milestones each time, and then business to government comes in scope in October 2027. Here, the Peppol format is not BIS. It is actually PINT, the international standard, which is different in a sense. Not dramatically different, but different in a sense. Also, there are requirements for message level responses between the service providers and the government. It's a 5-corner model. Again, here, the government is the 5th corner, and they're expecting to receive tax data documents, like Slovakia, from both the buyer and the supplier access point. So the moment a transaction is created in Peppol PINT, there also needs to be a tax data document being sent to the Ministry of Finance, to the government. However, not just that, but also a copy of the invoice from both sides. So that is different from, for instance, Slovakia. Also, the message level responses, the standard Peppol response levels also need to be adhered to. And it's important to do that because those are simply legal requirements. The other interesting thing about UAE is that, contrary to what you see in many other countries, is that exempt and zero-rated invoices are also in scope. So they also need to be going through the same transaction flow as normal tax invoices. Here too, there is an accreditation policy for e-invoicing providers, and the requirements are very different from those that we saw in Slovakia. Here, it's much more necessary to be a local entity, or at least be registered locally. You need to have data residency in the country, and there are some ISO requirements on accredited service providers in UAE. Tungsten Automation will support UAE, perhaps not as an accredited service provider, but we will we will be able to support our customers both inbound and outbound with the same level of service that we are capable of doing today. As I said, this is not a single phase implementation. It follows different steps, and it's important to understand when these steps apply to you. And as I said, these are driven by the level of revenue that you have. There's one other thing in Slovakia, as in UAE, that is pertinent, something to understand. And it's actually really important. Contrary to what you see in other countries, where you can use a separate e-invoicing provider or access point for outbound invoices versus inbound invoices, you can use two different providers to do that. You cannot do that in the UAE. You must have one provider to do both. So if you engage with a provider for instance, your outbound invoices, you need to use the same provider for your inbound invoices. That is something that you normally don't see in Peppol environments, but in this particular case, that has simply been legislated for and is a requirement. So you cannot have an outbound access point and a different inbound access point. It needs to be the same. It needs to be the same process. And as I said, exempted zero-rated supplies are in scope as well. They need to follow the Peppol flow as well as the tax data document flows as legislated for, as per also normal tax invoices. So 5-corner Peppol looks the same if you map out the data flows, but if you go under the hood, things are actually quite a bit different. Now let's move into Asia Pacific briefly and speak about New Zealand. New Zealand does not have a B2B mandate, but they do have B2G, so business to government obligations for private companies sending invoices to tax authority, to government agencies, including maybe the tax authorities. And already had legislation in place from the 1st of January 2026, and basically said that any government agency that receives more than 2,000 invoices a month, per year, they need to receive and send these invoices electronically. They need to have that capability. So the legislation that came in place in 2026 basically said, if you receive more than 2,000 invoices per annum, you're a government agency, you must be capable of sending and receiving electronic invoices. So that's on governmental level. What they've now said that by the 1st of January 2027, large suppliers that have revenues in excess of 33 million New Zealand dollars, they must invoice electronically to agencies that receive 2,000 invoices per annum. Well, that requires that companies and government agencies know each other well enough to understand who's in scope and who's not. It's really important that these are domestic trade invoices, so foreign invoices are not included, and there are some scope exclusions like employee expenses, rent or lease payments, but also credit card transactions and insurance are out of scope for the moment. You could, in a sense, argue that this is going into the direction of a run-up into B2B e-invoicing, and we know that there are discussions ongoing about that, but at the moment we don't really have clarity about when that might happen. But this, of course, is already a move away from the completely voluntary Peppol adoption into a more organized, more structured obligation on specific companies and agencies in the country. It's 4-corner Peppol. It's Peppol pinned. So there's no government entity here to report into because you're sending invoices to the government already. But it shows again that we just looked at 3 countries. They all do Peppol, but they all use Peppol in a slightly or sometimes dramatically different way. So whenever you think of Peppol as the panacea to everything. If you're Peppol compliant in one country, you're sort of done with all the other countries. I would immediately agree that it makes it easier, but it doesn't mean that you have covered every other country that goes down the path of a Peppol mandate. And there will be many more to come. Just mentioned Slovakia. There will be quite a number of other countries following that specific track, like France, and also Ireland, the UK, Norway, and on and on and on. And especially also under the VIDA directives, we will see more and more of these multi-corner models in lieu of the Italian-style central distribution models, which, frankly, are no longer allowed under the VIDA directive anyway. So I just took you through 3 countries with a Peppol obligations that look quite different once you go into the detail. And that's why it's so important to always go to the detail so you understand what will happen next. So if there's any questions about this, please let us know. Please use the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen. Pose your questions and our backstage team will take these questions and answer those as we go. Now, when I started, I promised you a bit about France. And that is because over the summer holidays, France made an update or a clarification that is important enough to spend a few minutes on. So let's go into what happened in France. So on the 16th of July, the French DGFiP, so the tax authorities, published a document with 29 questions that clarify the positions and the use cases and the actions to be taken when you are not entirely ready during the startup phase. And the startup phase is generally seen as the phase between the 1st of September 2026 and the 31st of December. So it's not endless, and it's not a grace period. It is not a delay. And I'm going to be saying that a number of times because it's really important. That DGFiP publication followed an announcement from the French Minister David Amiel, where he announced what we would call a tolerant, pragmatic approach to the enforcement of their tax reform. That specifically speaks about the automatic application of penalties in case of non-compliance. And the document, the 29-page document, basically discusses different scenarios if one or both parties in the process are not ready. What should you do? Excuse me. And again, it is not to be interpreted as a relaxation of the mandate. It is not to be interpreted as a delay or as a grace period. Well, they're basically saying that penalties will not automatically apply. But that doesn't mean the same thing as penalties won't apply automatically. That's a different thing. And it's really important to understand that there are steps to be taken if you find yourself in a specific situation. And of course, we, as a platform agréé, we will continue to support our customers through all the required steps that may apply to them. To briefly remind you of France, of the complexity in the country, it is a very, very broad and also very deep mandate. It is complex, or perhaps even complicated. It involves e-invoicing compliance for domestic transactions. Invoices must be in structured format. For those transactions not in e-invoicing, they need to be reported on, like in international transactions or consumer transactions. Every invoice that flows through the invoicing cycle needs to be managed through life cycles. So as an invoice changes status, that needs to be reported back to both the sender as well as the tax authorities. And depending on your VAT type registration, you also need to declare the payment status of your invoices. We have seen fragments of these elements in other countries, but France brings it all together into a fairly broad and deep, complex, complicated mandate. So the government acknowledges that it is quite possible that not everybody is going to be ready from day one, those who are in scope. And that acknowledgement led to that statement I said earlier by saying we will take a tolerant, pragmatic approach in case companies find themselves in a non-compliant situation for all or some of their obligations. But three key principles apply in that document that was released by DGFIP. First of all, it makes no changes to the legal timetable. So whatever was agreed in law, basically, and in the fiscal code and in the decrees, doesn't change at all. The 1st of September is still the start of the mandate, and smaller companies come into scope on the 1st of September 2027. There are no delays, nothing is pushed out. It's really important that this is not a delay. It's also not a grace. It also doesn't mean that if you can't comply, penalties automatically will not be forced upon you. That's not the case. However, the government does realize that economic continuity needs to come first. They basically say that the French mandate changes the way invoices flow between buyers and suppliers and reporting obligations, but it doesn't change the nature of transactions between businesses. So if you receive an invoice, regardless of the format really, you can't disregard it. You do need to process and pay it. And that comes down to the idea of the economic continuity is important. So the French government is not expecting businesses to put their continuity at stake or to put their economic continuity at risk or in jeopardy. And they're basically also saying that VAT remains deductible if you receive and process and pay invoices that are in what they call degraded format, which is PDF or paper. Your VAT remains deductible so long as you can prove that that transaction is a genuine transaction and that the invoices contain all the mandatory mentions, so have all the mandatory data to be a legal invoice. But again, even if you're in a situation where economic continuity forces you to take certain steps or to process in a certain manner outside the mandate, that is not a durable exemption, meaning that it is not an excuse for not moving forward. You should not delay. You should keep pace. You should be fast. You absolutely must go compliant. So again, both the statement from David Damiel as well as the DGFIP communication should not be interpreted as an excuse or a reason for you to slow down. You have to be quick. What does that mean for these penalties? As I said earlier, they won't be applied automatically, but also will not be applied automatically. And what that means is that whenever you are in a situation of non-compliance for part or all of your solution for the French mandate, then you basically need to provide evidence so you can show good faith. The government simply wants to see that you are in a genuine project, that you have connected to a platform agréé, that you can send and receive electronic invoices at some point in the very near future. If you're not engaged with a PA, if you're not in a project, if you're not showing any remedy for problems, you are putting yourself at risk of penalties. That's basically what it comes down to. And they make a distinction in the document between invoice receipt and invoice sending and e-reporting and avoidance of duplication. It takes too long to go through each and every question here, but it basically says that from the perspective of invoice receiving, if you're in scope for September 2026, and that's pretty much any company in France that is in scope, and if you're not yet engaged with a receiving a platform agréé, you must do this immediately without delay. You must be connected to a PA because that's the only way, frankly, that in the new reform, you're going to be able to receive electronic invoices. Of course, there will be invoices outside the PA structure. Those come from suppliers not in scope for the mandate. But for those suppliers in scope for the mandate, they need to be sending these invoices through the PA structure. So if you don't have a PA, they'll be blocking that. So you must act immediately. The second thing I wanted to stress from this page and this slide is that I hear companies suggesting that they want to hold off on the registration of their entities onto the annuaire. If you remember, the annuaire is the central database, call it the central phone book, that determines the routing of the invoices from the supplier to the buyer. And again, by not registering onto the annuaire, you are blocking the sender PA from finding you and your PA. So it's not a good idea to not register, because the law says that you need to be capable of receiving electronic invoices. This means that you need to have a PA and that you need to be registered into the annuaire. Whether or not you are capable of automatically working with your PA to receive these invoices and process these automatically, that's not the question here. The question is the ability to receive electronic invoices. That's why the government is saying switch on what works. So if you have elements of your solution that do work, switch these on, use them. The government is trying very hard to stimulate usage, to stimulate uptake, so that companies don't wait until their entire infrastructure is ready and stable. I know there's a bit of friction there between these two things, because you want things to be stable and ready. The French government are stimulating taxpayers to not wait until everything is done and dusted. If you do find yourself into an exceptional situation where certain elements of your process are not yet fully stable or tested or ready, then you need to provide the tax authorities with evidence if you're asked to provide that. So it's not like you can go to a website and say, here's my evidence for reasons for not being compliant. It's more that, when asked, you need to be able to show that you are trying to go live, you are aware of your issues, you have remedies in place, and you need to show all pieces of evidence that you have available. And actually, an active registration of your entities onto the annuaire is indeed seen as proper evidence. Absence thereof is seen as the contrary and may point at not good faith. Pretty much the same goes for issuance. If you're not entirely ready, bring live what works is the statement here. And also, as soon as you are capable, the recommendation is that you regularize your invoices, so you report these outbound invoices to the tax authority, to the PPF, using Flow 1, and also that you make your electronic copy of the invoice available to the buyer. Now, again, there's friction here. I understand that. Everybody understands that. You may have already sent an invoice through another channel. You may have already sent an invoice through, PDF. And now you're sending another invoice through the structure. That could lead to duplication. So there are very strong comments in the DGFIP guidance that point at avoidance of duplication and also avoidance of loss of transactions. But it basically says that if you have shortfalls, go live with what works, document your shortfalls, document your remedies, and ensure that you solve these as soon as possible. And once these are solved, we recommend that you regularize these invoices, so you report these and send them as electronic invoices to the buyer. By the way, that is not an obligation yet. It is simply a strong recommendation that you do that. Same goes for e-reporting. Without repeating myself too much, bring live what works. But here, of course, the requirement is going to be that you retain the data so that you can report on specific periods in time when required, depending on how and what reporting regime you're in, that you can re-report transactions that couldn't be reported the first time, but also keep log files that you actually did attempt to report and it failed for some reason. It also means that, and that's also quite clear in the guidance, that if you can't report on certain transactions yet, international transactions or perhaps consumer transactions, it doesn't render the transactions themselves invalid or it doesn't devalue these. It's really about the reporting side here. And again, ensure that you have evidence in place, that there is a plan to remedy, that you highlight very clearly what did not work, and you work with your platform agréé to ensure that you have a joint, good, solid, consistent message. And as soon as you are capable of reporting these transactions to the tax authorities, you should. So even if earlier reports failed, once you are capable, these earlier reports need to be reported to the PPF as soon as you can. So again, the guidance isn't meant to tell people that they can take their foot off the pedal, that they can slow down and take it easy. Not at all. The instruction is to keep going as fast as possible, work towards compliance with your PA, and do that to the best of your abilities. Where you have shortfalls, the recommendation is that you document these clearly. You have plans in place to remedy and improve the situation. That you have timelines in place, project plans. You have records of conversations with your PA, so you can evidence that you're doing everything you can to go compliant as soon as possible, even though you may be in shortfall. So it's a relaxation in the sense of so long as you are really trying, you're probably going to be good. But if you can't show that you are really trying, that may become very difficult conversation with the tax authority. But again, there's no website you need to go to or no forms you need to fill out to ask for leniency, but you may be asked to provide proof of where you are and what your actions have been over the recent past. Important guidance, and we thought it was important enough to take you through a bit of that in today's session. And again, we're not a tax advisory, so if you have specific questions about your situation, please talk to your tax advisory to ensure you get that level of confidence and information directly from a qualified tax advisory. Now, back to my mantra always, because we always speak a lot about compliance, about what governments require you to do. And that is critical and key. If you're not compliant, you can't exist as a company, really, especially in mandated environments. You're not a company if you don't comply. If you keep yourself out of all the structures, you're simply not a company. But that doesn't give you any guarantees for your survival. You may exist, but in order to survive, you need to compete. And competition is very often done through efficiency, to be faster, leaner, quicker, at lower cost than your direct competition. And that competition doesn't always have to be in the same country that you're in. They can come from other countries where perhaps completely different rules and perhaps even easier rules may apply. So it is always important that you keep automation in the back of your mind. Compliance gets you to not fall out with the government and their requirements, but it doesn't help you survive. You must be efficient. So whenever you plan for the next mandate or the next wave of mandates, always keep in mind that the partner you work with needs to not only make you compliant in the country, but also needs to make sure that you increase your efficiencies on a continuous basis. That is really important. And in that sense, I would argue that you consider mandates from governments not just as an intrusion or a distraction, which it can very, very easily be if you don't have a real strategic plan, if you're not looking far enough ahead and looking at what do I need to do today to remove the distraction from my business in the forthcoming years. Because as I said earlier, this isn't going to go away, even after VIDA, which many people see as sort of like the end point of developments in mandates. It won't be. There's already discussions on European level beyond VIDA. What happens then? Where are we going to go next? This isn't going to go away. So you have a choice. It's a choice between blind panic, being reactive, where mandates are basically extremely intrusive, very distracting, to using it as a strategic planner and a strategic driver to see what can I do today to ensure that I use these mandates as a wave I can ride on to improve my efficiencies. To give you a few ideas, many customers that we work with have global templates. It basically means that they have an idea of how the world will roll out, and they've sublimated all these requirements into a global operating template. They also work with a global or sometimes a few regional partners, depending on where you trade. It's also been proven that companies that have supply chains that are already electrified to a certain extent or a good extent, that for them, implementing mandates is much easier. And as I said, always look at where can I improve invoice automation by using the better inbound data coming from the mandatory processes, because typically that data will already be structured and gives you opportunities to do better on the automation front. If you have any questions about this, if you want to know more about this, please let us know. The Q&A section is still open. We have a little bit of time before today's section closes. I'm at the end of my story for today. I would ask you, if you have any further questions, please post them. We can answer them here straight away. And if we can't, we'll come back to you offline. For today, I'd like to thank you for your time, your attention. If you have any questions, please let them come to us. Thank you.